Louisiana Purchase, the biggest real estate deal in world history. Or so we're told. 4 cents an acre. There's something to that, I suppose. One of the problems with the characterization, of course, and it's not the topic that I'm going to talk about now, is that there are a whole bunch of other folks with claims to those lands. All of the tribes who live there in the U.S. ended up having to buy a lot of same lands from the tribal claims to those lands in future years. So 4 cents an acre is a bit of an exaggeration. The other thing that we don't remember is how controversial the purchase was as a constitutional law matter. And that's going to be the focus of this talk. We tend, again, to look back and think, what a great thing. Expanding the size of the country, doubling the size of the United States. Manifest destiny became the term used later as the English colonies marched towards the Pacific, or the newly independent former English colonies marched towards the Pacific. This is inevitable, and it's great and a good thing and important. In fact, contemporaries didn't entirely view it that way. Some did. The folks in power did. Thomas Jefferson did. He thought this was the greatest thing that could possibly have happened. But a lot of folks weren't happy about it. And so I want to talk a bit about the circumstances that gave rise to the purchase and the politics involved, and then work through the constitutional problems that were identified by contemporaries. And then we'll finish by sort of revisiting a topic that has recurred in this course, which is the problem of constitutional ambiguity and the ways in which the government deals with it, sometimes by confronting it directly and sometimes by closing its eyes, crossing its fingers, and hoping that nobody pays attention, and we sort of move past it until the Supreme Court subsequently says it's okay, which is kind of, as you'll see, what happened here. Now, Louisiana, Thomas Jefferson becomes president in the election of 1800. His vice president, Aaron Burr. The European world is in turmoil at this time. The French Revolution begins in 1789. The French Terror, followed by the rise of a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, who by the turn of the 19th century is creating all sorts of havoc in Europe and conquering countries one a week, it seems, for a while. Now, Louisiana, which had been French originally, has for some time, since before the American Revolution, actually been claimed by Spain. And this includes the city of New Orleans, much of the architecture of which, by the way, is Spanish and not French. So when you go to Mardi Gras, credit the Spanish a little bit for the old downtown area. And as long as it's Spanish, there's not a whole lot of federal concern. The Spanish aren't perceived as a military threat. They're busy battling the French. The United States is not involved in the Napoleonic Wars. The British are, of course. And to the extent that Americans are paying attention to Louisiana, it's really focused, their attention is focused on the port of New Orleans. And the reason is that there are Americans living west of the Appalachian Mountains. There's a state out there, the state of Kentucky, which joined the Union in 1792. And there are farmers in Kentucky who like to sell things. And they really have 2 choices. They can either cart things over the mountains, which is expensive and time-consuming, or they can get on a boat and sail down the Ohio River and end up in the Mississippi and take it out into the world market through the port of New Orleans. And so there is interest, federal interest, in securing rights to use the port of New Orleans to export things through this Spanish-held territory. And there's lots of discussion of, well, maybe we could someday acquire New Orleans. That would make life easier. There's a bit of a domestic politics concern, because a lot of folks in Kentucky are thinking, you know, maybe we ought to just join the Spanish. Maybe we should leave the United States and become part of the Spanish Empire, because it'd make it a whole lot easier to sell our stuff and run it through New Orleans. And Jefferson's concerned about this a little bit. And then the news arrives, by way of rumor initially, that Napoleon has cut a deal with Spain, and the French have taken over New Orleans and the rest of Louisiana. And all of a sudden, this becomes a hot issue. Because if Napoleon's in charge, that's different from the sort of perceived as being in some decline, decrepit old Spanish Empire being in charge. There's a possibility that Napoleon will choose to militarize New Orleans, will make conditions for American use much more onerous, will encourage Kentucky to break away. And so Jefferson, fairly new to office, sends instructions to his agents in France to find out if this is true, and then to see if there's a chance that the French would be willing to make a deal to sell New Orleans. And while they're at it, let's see if we can buy the Floridas too, which is East and West Florida, which is collectively Florida now in the northern Gulf Coast. No thought about anything more than New Orleans in those territories now restored to French claim. But money's appropriated or directed to be used to make this deal for the port of New Orleans. Time passes. Turns out that the French do claim to have bought it. Questions as to whether that was legal. That's a Spanish and French law issue. But as far as the Americans are concerned, the French own this land or the claim to this land that Spain formerly owned. And the negotiations go well. In fact, they go much better than expected. And word comes back to President Jefferson that not only have his negotiators acquired New Orleans, they've acquired all the rest of the Louisiana Territory, stretching all the way up the Mississippi into the northern plain states. And it's an absolutely enormous amount of land. Now, this is exciting for Jefferson. Congress isn't in session when the news comes in, but it's also a bit troublesome. It's a treaty. Treaties get negotiated by the executive, and then they get ratified by the Senate. But Jefferson isn't sure that he's empowered to execute a treaty providing for the acquisition of land by the federal government. And there's more in the treaty. The citizens of the Louisiana Territory are supposed to become U.S. citizens as soon as possible. Can the president, with Senate ratification, create a whole large new group of United States citizens? There are provisions in there regarding trade rights for French and Spanish vessels, that they're supposed to, for 12 years, be able to continue to use the port of New Orleans without paying any more in tariffs than the Americans would pay. Well, can the president agree to that? Because there's a constitutional provision, Article 1, that says that all the ports have to be treated the same. And then what happens is, who administers this land? Is it a federal territory? Is it a state? A really, really big state? Is it a bunch of little states? Is slavery allowed there? And all of these questions are unanswered. As President Jefferson and his cabinet sit down and correspond over this summer of 1803 to try and figure out just what to do with this, there is pressure. There's pressure because Napoleon needs the money, which is the reason that he's selling it, because he's fighting everybody in Europe. And so he's given them a period of just a few months. This is a take it or leave it deal. If we don't hear back from you by this date, then we'll assume you don't want to buy it, and then we'll just do something with it. So there is no time. Now, Jefferson ran for office. His constitutional position was as a strict constructionist. So the Constitution says this, and that's what it means. We don't read the words of the Constitution generously in some sort of living constitutional manner. He wouldn't have used that phrase, to enhance federal power. And his core constituency, especially his southern constituents, are very committed to this. Strict construction of the Constitution. The expansive folks, the national power folks, are concentrated in New England. And so the politics of this have created a bit of a constitutional conundrum for him, because there is nothing in the Constitution that says the federal government can buy lands from foreign countries and incorporate them into the United States. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows expressly for this differential treatment of ports, or that allows the president to accept new people as United States citizens, even with the ratification of the Senate. So he's going to be forced to adopt a theory that says that treaties can do more things than the federal government could do independent of treaties. Congress couldn't do this by statute, but by treaty I can do this. And that's something that a strict constructionist wouldn't do. So Jefferson's first instinct is to say, well, we've got to amend the Constitution. We've got to think all this through, what we want to do with this land, and then amend the Constitution. And here's an amendment. And he actually drafts one, and I'm going to read it to you. This would have been the 13th Amendment, which the real abolished slavery, right? It would have been this. Jefferson's amendment says, Louisiana, as ceded by France to the U.S., is made a part of the U.S. Its white inhabitants shall be citizens and stand as their rights and obligations on the same footing with other citizens of the U.S. in analogous situations, save only that as to the portion thereof lying north of the latitude of the mouth of the Arkansas River, no new state shall be established, nor any grants of land made therein other than to Indians, in exchange for equivalent portions of land occupied by them, until amendment to the Constitution shall be made for those purposes. He sent that to Madison, said, what do you think? And he sent that to other people as well. And the universal response, the most common response was, we don't have time for this. The clock's ticking. Napoleon needs to hear back from us. We're going to lose this opportunity. So new theories came out. Well, let's just use the existing Constitution in some way. I mentioned that the politics became confused, and that's because Jefferson's strict constructionist base in the South loved the idea of acquiring Louisiana, in part because most of the occupied portions were in the southern part, and the expectation was they would become new slave states. For that very reason, the northern states were angry about this because it was going to upset the balance of power between slave and free states in the federal Congress, between southern and northern blocks, which had been maintained jealously right up to the point at which Louisiana suddenly came into the picture. So you've got New Englanders adopting expansive construction, or rather strict construction views, to stop the president from doing this without a constitutional amendment, and Southerners, formerly strict construction, saying, no, no, the Constitution, ambiguous words, let's read it generously. Treaty power, sure, not a problem. Other theories, yeah, we can work through these. Time will pass, and eventually everything will be okay. It made for very odd alliances. Now, but it didn't entirely settle this constitutional anxiety. One of the people who was in favor of Louisiana, there are lots of illustrations of this, thought, I know what we'll do. Here's how we'll solve the constitutional problem. Let's find out, and we talk about originalism now and going back to what the framers thought. Well, understand this is 1803. The framers were at home, like watching television. So we can call the framers and see what they thought this was. Somebody wrote to Gouverneur Morris in New York and said, can we do this? Is this treaty constitutional to acquire all this land? And I'm going to read you the first part of his response. And this is the problem often when historians try and do research into the understanding of the framers. Morris replied, it's not possible for me to recollect with precision all that passed in the convention while we were framing the Constitution. And if I could, it's most probable that a meaning would have been conceived from incidental expressions different from that which they were intended to convey, and very different from the fixed opinions of the speaker. This happens daily, and that's the problem. That was the problem when they had the framers to talk to. Uncertainty about exactly what it was that was intended and whether a particular exercise of power was comprehended within the powers delegated to the federal government in the Constitution. So what happens? Well, the Jeffersonians decide to just plow ahead. They go ahead, the treaty is executed, the Senate ratifies the treaty. People are objecting and yelling, you can't do this, especially New Englanders. But then you've got all of this land, the title is transferred ceremonially in New Orleans and then in St. Louis, and there are people living there. But what happens to those people? Well, they have to be governed somehow. So Congress says, well, I guess there's a provision that says that Congress governs the territories. It's argued that that only applied to the old Northwest Territory, which existed at the time the Constitution was ratified. But these are kind of new federal acquisitions, so maybe that works. So maybe Congress should come up with some sort of plan of government. So Congress starts to work on that. But what happens in the meantime? Because these lands are ours, like immediately upon ratification, transfer of title, and these folks are living there with no laws. So Congress passes a sort of a short fix that says, well, Jefferson can run the place. They assign to the president the power to pick all the officers of government and decide exactly what their scope of authority should be. This arouses all sorts of opposition too. How is it that the president, so you talk about enhancing the power of the federal government, now we've just given one person, the federal executive, control over the governance of tens of thousands of people in an area of country that's as large as the existing United States. And so all these challenges of tyranny, et cetera, are voiced fairly aggressively and understandably. Now, including from the inhabitants of the Louisiana Territory, by the way, who are like, what? Now we're under the control of this one person who's going to decide what our government is? And then, of course, the slavery issue came up, and that becomes very contentious. You know, in some ways, there are lots of legacies of Louisiana, and I'll finish with this. The problem of constitutional ambiguity, the problem of executive authority, federal versus state. But one of the perhaps more interesting is this problem of territorial expansion and sectional economic animosity. The slave states all of a sudden can expand. And that isn't anything that had figured into the national discourse up to that time. There had been federal territories, but the Northwest Ordinance said they're not going to allow slavery. And so in some ways, I guess the Louisiana Purchase, the constitutional crisis, the ambiguity in the authorizing language is a story of just that, of constitutional ambiguity, resolved incidentally in 1828 by a Supreme Court decision that says, yeah, Congress can do this. You can ratify treaties acquiring new land, and so Florida can, you know, become federal territory. So there's part that, the ambiguity of the document and the difficulty in application, the politics that gets involved in that. But it's also an important part of the story that will culminate in the Civil War, because the territorial expansion that occurs with the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory and the decision to allow slavery to exist in much of that territory will fuel the sort of sectional, what amounts to an arms race in terms of political representation in Congress that will lead in just under 60 years to the Civil War. Thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.